How to make espresso powder. Espresso powder is most often used by bakers to enhance the flavor of brownies, cookies, and chocolate cakes. You can buy it from specialty stores, but you can also make a batch of your own espresso powder at home. All you need is espresso beans, a baking sheet, and a coffee grinder. Use your espresso powder to amp up baked goods, make a delicious steak rub, and even whip together a delicious hot beverage. Roasting the beans. Use 1 cup 200 grams of espresso beans to make 1 cup of espresso powder. Depending on how often you use espresso powder, you could make a bigger or smaller batch. Fresh beans that have been newly purchased will produce the best flavor, so try to make your espresso powder before your beans go stale. Beans generally stay fresh for about 2 weeks after they've been opened. If they're in a special container with a degassing valve, they could last for up to 6 months. Tip: if you have espresso grounds left over from your morning coffee, you can also use them to make espresso powder. Simply spread the used grounds out on a baking sheet and bake them in the oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit (93 degrees Celsius) for about 1 hour. Run the baked grounds through a grinder to pulverize them even further, and then store them in an airtight container. Preheat the oven to 200 degrees Fahrenheit (93 degrees Celsius). The goal of baking the espresso beans is to slightly roast them while also drying them out even further. This helps them be ground to a much finer consistency. If you use a temperature lower than 200 degrees Fahrenheit (93 degrees Celsius), you'll need to increase the total cooking time to compensate. For example, cooking at 170 degrees Fahrenheit (77 degrees Celsius) would require about 1.5 hours of baking time. Spread the espresso beans over a baking sheet in a single layer. Use an unlined, ridged baking sheet. The ridge will keep the beans from accidentally spilling over the edge. Try to space the beans apart a little bit so that the hot air can get between all of them. A perk to baking the espresso beans is that your house will smell fantastic for a little while. Bake the espresso beans for about 1 hour to give them a toasted flavor. Set a timer and let the oven do its work. There's no need to check on the beans or flip them during the 1-hour cook time. If you skip the baking step, the beans could create a powder that is a little too bitter for your baking needs. Let the beans cool off for about 10 minutes once they're done baking. Once the timer goes off, use an oven mitt to remove the baking sheet from the oven. Set the baking sheet on top of the stove and let the beans cool off until they're no longer hot to the touch. If you let the beans cool off for longer than 10 minutes, that is totally fine. 10 minutes is just the minimum so that the beans aren't still hot when you go to grind them. Grinding and storing the powder. Grind the espresso beans in small 1/4 cup 50-gram batches. Smaller batches will make a finer powder. If you did the entire cup at once, it would be hard to really grind things down to a fine consistency. Use a coffee grinder set to the finest grind possible and pulse each batch for 15 to 20 seconds. Tip: if you don't have a coffee or spice grinder, you could also use a mortar and pestle or even a food processor. Transfer the espresso powder to an airtight container. Once the espresso beans have been ground into a fine, powder-like substance, use a spoon to transfer them into a storage container. Pick a container that is resealable or that has a tight-fitting lid. Keep in mind that a plastic container will absorb the smell and oil from the powder, so you may want to designate a specific container for your espresso powder. Store the espresso powder in a cool, dry location for up to 6 months. If you made a big batch of espresso powder, rest assured that you have ample time to use it all up. Put it in a cupboard or pantry where it won't come into contact with any moisture. After 6 months, the powder will still be technically good, it just won't be as fresh or the best quality anymore. Adding espresso powder to recipes. Add espresso powder to your baking recipes for a rich, deep flavor. For most cookies, brownies, and chocolate cakes, add just a teaspoon 2 grams of espresso powder to really enhance the flavor of the recipe. Add an additional teaspoon 2 grams for an actual coffee flavor. Don't worry, a little espresso powder doesn't have to make your sweets taste like coffee. It really just enhances the flavors that are already in a sweet treat, especially when chocolate is involved. Create a smoky steak rub with espresso powder, paprika, and brown sugar. Use 1 teaspoon 2 grams of smoked paprika, 1 teaspoon 2 grams of light brown sugar, 2 teaspoons 4 grams of espresso powder, and 2 teaspoons 4 grams of salt. Mix them together in a small bowl and sprinkle the rub onto both sides of a steak before you cook it. Cook the steak however you prefer and enjoy. Feel free to mix up the rub by adding different spices. Cinnamon or chili powder would make a great addition. Make mornings special with cinnamon sugar espresso toast. Combine 1 tablespoon 12.5 grams of sugar, 1 teaspoon 2 grams of cinnamon, and 1 teaspoon 2 grams of espresso powder. Make your toast, butter it, and sprinkle the sugar mixture over top. If you don't like butter, use a butter substitute. One or the other is necessary, otherwise, the sugar mixture won't have anything to stick to. Enjoy a hot mocha toddy during the colder months. In a saucepan over medium heat, mix together 1/4 cup 50 grams of light brown sugar, 1 tablespoon 7 grams of cocoa powder, 2 tablespoons 12 grams of espresso powder, 2 cups 470 milliliters of milk, and 1/2 cup 120 milliliters of heavy cream. Heat the mixture until it is almost boiling, and then distribute it amongst mugs. Top the drink with whipped cream sprinkled with espresso powder. To add an extra kick to your hot toddy, pour 1/2 cup 120 milliliters of vodka into the pan along with the other ingredients. Tips: if you don't have or can't make espresso powder, use double the amount called for of instant coffee. You could also sub out some liquid from the recipe and use that same amount of liquid espresso. Espresso powder is caffeinated, so use decaf espresso beans if you want to steer clear of the caffeine. Things you'll need: espresso beans, baking sheet, coffee grinder, airtight storage container, oven mitt.